Welcome to the Female Finance Collective, where we encourage women to have open and honest conversations about all things money. In today's episode, we're going to talk about the 50-30-20 rule when it comes to budgeting. As always, our content is for education and informational purposes and designed to have some of those conversations around money, but it is not specific advice and should be just seen as entertainment and information. Jen, you were going to start us off with explaining what the 50-30-20 rule is when it comes to creating a budget for yourself or your family.
When I first heard this, I was like 50 I had no idea. So I definitely had to do a little learning. So if you're hearing us say this and you're like, "What are they talking about?" You are not alone. But the 50-30-20 is a pretty well-known guideline in the money world, right? So not to everybody, I don't think, but and what it means is that you're going to take 50%, about 50% of your income and use that towards your needs. Things like housing, transportation, insurance, like all those things that you kind of have to survive, food, all of that. Then the 30% is going to be for those wants. That's where you're going to have your dining out, your entertainment. I think clothing, some elements of clothing obviously fall under needs, some elements will fall under wants. That this is where I always like to say you have to have the hard conversation with yourself about what is a want versus a need, right? But I think you all know what we're talking about. And then the 20% is should be dedicated to savings. That's kind of what the thought of the 50-30-20 rule is. What I like to say to people who are just getting started is this is just a really good guideline for you. If you do your percentages after you listen to this episode and you're like, oh my gosh, my needs are 75% and my wants are 25% and I'm a 0% of savings, that is not a reason to panic. That's just information for you to use to start planning what you want to do next. So maybe you're going to set a goal that you're going to make some adjustments so that instead of 75-25, you're 70, 20-10, or you're just going to start making some little adjustments to think about where you want to be. This is not a hard and fast rule that everybody follows. Full disclosure, I do not know our breakdown percentage like this. I could figure it out pretty easily, but I don't know what it is now. But it's a really good guideline for several reasons that we're going to chat about today. But really, I think if you're just getting started, I didn't know how much of my budget should I be spending on the fun stuff? How much should I be spending on going out to eat if this is my income? So having a guide like this for me when I was very first setting up my budget would have been really helpful. So I just knew where to start.
That's a great explanation, Jen. And when I got started, I hadn't heard of this rule either. So early in my career, I think I did a little bit of reading and I came across a book or an article and it spoke about trying to set aside 10 to 20% of your income and put that towards saving and investing. So I did that part from the get-go. And I also still had some debt. So that's one of the things. If you do have debt repayments, you can include that in that 20% savings category because you are saving interest, future interest payments. So, you can consider that a form of saving and include that in the 20%. So that should help not feel quite as stressed because it is difficult to set aside 20% of your income to go towards savings. So that's how I got started on that path. And it wasn't until much later that I came across those other percentages. And the way that I did look at my budget using those parameters, and for a while, the housing was way over the 50% because in Canada, our housing is quite expensive. And I just adjusted some of the want categories. So, I was able to still make that work with my own percentages. So, it's not a hard and fast rule, but it's a nice framework to get started, especially if you're newer on your financial journey.
Yeah, that's what I love about this framework too, is it helps you just like visualize and see the buckets of money, right? And like you said, for a lot of us, especially now with inflation and all the things, life is just expensive now and housing's super expensive. It's like, how are our children going to be able to afford houses in the future, right? So, but it helps me visualize. I could see that pie chart with 50% needs and 30% wants and 20% savings or paying off debt to your financial goals, right? And that helps me adjust, just like you said, Marilee. It helps me think, okay, if my needs are higher because of my rent or my mortgage payment, what of my wants am I going to need to, pull back on? Another thing I like, Jen, I couldn't tell you my exact percentages right now, but I definitely can see the big categories in my head, those buckets that I was talking about. And so speaking of financial goals, which is something that we really talk about a lot here at the Female Finance Collective on our podcast, because we want you talking and thinking about money, but we also want you taking action, right? Talking and thinking and learning are all crucial, but taking action is where the change happens in your life. And so setting financial goals, we did a whole little mini series, right, ladies? We had long-term goals, short-term, medium-term goals, short-term goals that just aired the last couple weeks. So go back and check those out because financial goals for all of us are just so, so important. And so I love that this framework really targets that and has that as a piece of it. Like 20% is either paying off debt, savings, investing, right? Or 10%, whatever. Some people going for the FIRE movement try to get that up to 50% savings, right? Like that's just the choice they're making. But looking at your money in big buckets, those three big buckets, to me is super helpful. So one example, recently I actually used this budget. We'll actually post with this podcast a link to a free prioritize your savings guide that walks you through the 50, 30, 20 budget. And you can use that. It's a workbook. But one of the ways I used it recently is I printed up this workbook and I wrote it all out because my financial goals were changing. Over the last year or so, we decided we were going to try to buy a home possibly if the right one came up. And so instead of our automatic payment into our investment account, we decided to stop that temporarily for about a year, maybe a year and a half, probably about a year. And then instead of that money going into our investment account, we put it into a high yield savings to build up some of our down payment, right? Because you need a big chunk when you buy a home. And so that's a way that this budget really helped me. At that time, I did do the math and see what my percentages were. So I could allot the right amount of money. It wasn't necessarily the exact amount I was putting into my investment accounts, right? Because I could make some decisions. Let's cut out some clothing this month. Let's cut out, some of those wants. And then another way it helped me in this move was like, okay, our needs are really high. I felt like our rent was really high. So how are we going to make this move actually make our needs go down as well? So just really understanding those three buckets for me is, I'm just that kind of thinker, that visual thinker. It's really transformational for me in that way too. And I love that you call it a framework because that's really what it is. And it's so flexible. Like
Yeah.
those percentages are just, they stick because whoever invented it said that, right? And I think the rule of thumb is, in the United States anyway, if you put 20% into investments, you'll be able to retire at 65. Don't know if that's actually true at this point, but I think that was kind of the thinking when this framework was first developed. But I love the flexibility of it.
Yeah, I love the flexibility too. And it can be a great tool for decision making because if you see that your needs are taking up a huge portion of your income, then that could be a time where you need to make some of those tougher decisions. Sometimes I've seen that where people go down to one vehicle instead of having two because it's the car payments, it's, all of those things that as a total become such a big piece of your income. And sometimes it's realizing that we don't actually spend much on ourselves. So the wants, there is very little there. So sometimes it's actually increasing your spending to make sure that you're getting to enjoy some of the lifestyle parts today. So it's not always cutting back. It can be just looking at what you spend money on, from those different needs-based categories. The other way that I use this exercise is to see what to put into an emergency fund. So some of those wants that we buy, so clothing that isn't necessary, it's more just lifestyle related. If you had a big emergency, you're going to cut back some of those purchases. You may not be able to travel. So you're really left with your needs and maybe some savings. So it can give you a good idea of how much to set aside in case of an emergency, like what monthly amount your emergency fund would need to cover to keep you going until you're able to return to work or whatever the other emergency is to cover those costs related to it.
I think that's so important because I think that oftentimes what we hear people say when it comes to emergency fund is you need to have like 3 to 6 months of your income or your salary or whatever. And for some people, that's totally doable, right? And for other people, that is feels impossible. Like they're never going to be able to get that much money put away. And so I like the idea of just focusing on the actual needs. Like, what do you have to pay for every month? Like, if there was an emergency and you knew, okay, there's no dining out, there's no like extra fun snacks at the grocery store, there's no clothing purchases, like, it's just the bare bones. What would we need? That makes it feel so much more doable, I think, when it comes to putting that money into the savings fund. And then it also makes you feel like you're making a little more progress, right? Like, okay, I've got a month covered, where I feel like sometimes it feels like you're going to be saving for 2 years to cover like a month of your, in your emergency fund. So I like that you're thinking about it from different angles. We're not just preparing for like a big purchase or just reevaluating our breakdown, but we're also using it to like plan for how much we should have in savings and planning for those unexpected things that come up, because that is also the stuff that, if you're in the foundation building and the plan building phase, those are some of the things that you're just not sure how to navigate, right? And sometimes having a framework or having just a jumping off point makes it so much more manageable because you know where to start.
Yeah. And sometimes too, if you're not saving anything, it can be a bit of a reality check. So if you're looking at your expenses and everything, or a lot of what you're buying is want based, but you're not able to save, then it's doing that reality check and seeing if there is something that you could change that could be directed towards saving for your future. Because, the big piece of finances is that you're able to buy stuff, you're able to make decisions, you're allowed to have fun with your money and with your life. It's just you can't buy all the things. So it's figuring out how to balance what you want today with putting some money away for your future self. So just future orienting your finances.
Yeah, I love that perspective. That's such a good way to think about it. And it for me, it's been like I get aha moments because I sometimes get intimidated or scared or overwhelmed by the daily small tracking, right? The Amazon purchase and the grocery store purchase, like that can overwhelm me sometimes. But this is a little bit bigger, zoomed out picture. And I can see, wow, we spend, this much on just food in general, or we spend this much on our cars in general. And that can be a good reality check. And sometimes it's hard and you have to feel all the feels. But then hopefully moving forward, you can be like, what I do is I try to be like, okay, how could I change that if that really affected me that much? What could I do? We're thinking about cars because we have two teenagers, one in college, and we didn't send her with a car. So our son is here and I work from home. So we have two cars with three drivers. And, we're like, will our daughter need a car next year? They're so expensive and da da da. And then we were like, well, maybe she could do an e-bike. Like those are super popular. They're pricey, but not near as pricey as a car, right? And my husband is e-biking to work. We chose a house so he could e-bike to work. And we make those decisions after the hard reality of seeing how much cars, for example, when we moved back to the States, we had to buy 2 cars, right? All at the same time. And then how much they are to maintain. My gosh, the oil changes alone. It's like, and this budget helped us see that. And for me, it's a little less overwhelming than the small numbers. So that's something I love about this budget as well.
Yeah, it has tons of positives. I think the key takeaways, hopefully, people are hearing us say is don't let these numbers overwhelm you. Adjust them if you need to where you are now. And then you can, if this is like an overall place you want to be, then just slowly make changes over time. It doesn't have to happen overnight. And don't be scared to have those hard conversations and be honest with yourself about the things that you need to change, about reality, right? Sometimes we can't get the car we really want. Sometimes we have to live in the smaller apartment or downsize or live with the furniture we don't really want for one more year, right? Sometimes we have to make those hard decisions. But if we are thinking about our future self and really focusing on where we want to be, that stress level, keeping that down, right? That really, in the end, is worth it. Even though in the short term, sometimes it doesn't feel like it, in the end, it really is worth it. So thank you so much for listening. Please be sure to like and follow our podcast. You can find us on Instagram and YouTube at Female Finance Collective. And as always, we would love to hear from you. So please don't hesitate to share your questions and comments. And we look forward to hearing from you.